A few weeks ago I made a video in this area of the property at the main edible acre site, the 6-acre site, where I was talking about an alternative way that I use sometimes to create hugelmounds with the idea of not planting into them right away, but rather letting them rot down over time and coming back to them. And that created a lot of interesting discussion and questions. I'm going to link to that video here so I don't repeat myself too much. But the basic gist of it is that most of the information you find online about making hugelmounds or hugelkultur, it's wonderful. It's a thorough way of making beds that are productive right out of the gate, or at least should be, but they're quite labor intensive and somewhat prohibitive for certain folks. So all the lumps you're seeing here are these future beds that I don't have any expectation to be able to plant into this spring and have them work out. But in this video, what I wanted to do is add a little bit more layer and detail to this and talk about how this area has evolved, so stick with me. So right now I'm standing at the southern edge looking due north into this particular little spot. A few weeks ago, more or less this entire canopy was filled with Scots pine, and so now there's this massive liberation of light and energy that can come down to the forest floor. This is a pretty thorough opening. One thing I want to say here, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the previous video, what I would absolutely never want to do is simply fell trees to make openings with the idea of, I'll plant into that someday, I don't know. I have trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants that are all ready to go into this area, and so that's why I cut this down. Now you're going to say, well, wait a minute, didn't you just say you have these hugelmounds that will take forever to plant into? Yes, I'm glad you're paying attention. The hugelmounds will be gardens in the future. They'll have time to rot down. It's the space between them. It's the areas in between these trees that are now being planted out. So let me explain a little bit in more detail here. So if you can imagine, right in this area was, let's see if I can see them. There was a stump for one pine tree here, one at the end of this little area, one over here. There are 3 or 4 trees in this area. You can see these are the main trunks of them. And so what I did intentionally is took their tops and the brush from these as I cut and processed and laid them up on beds that will be planted in the future. In between each of these stumps, the other day when Sasha and I were out here, we dug in. It was a little bit hard to dig because there are roots there, but we kind of moved around until we found a spot, and planted out very, very small. There was just enough of a thaw to be able to do this. But now everywhere you see a cage, and you can see here some permanent labels, which I talk about making in another video, these are all grafted mulberries. And so what was a monoculture of Scots pine, so there's 1, 2, there's actually 3, 4 in that one on this side, and then there's a few other with more space. What was monocultural Scots pine, which we're not doing incredibly well in here, is now a really diverse collection of pretty rare varietals of grafted mulberry. And each one has a big root geranium or 10 co-planted with them, which you can barely see through the snow. But there's the stem of the grafted mulberry buried deep under mulch, and the big root geranium to hopefully help defend it from voles and mice over winter. Now that's layer 1. That is the future canopy layer in here, or layer 1 and 2 with the herbaceous support. Next to, or in between these, will be planted jewel blackcap raspberries. I'll probably plant on the outside of them some Jerusalem artichokes as real biomass accumulators that will be used to chop and drop and feed them. And most likely, as time allows, we'll be sprinkling seeds for amaranth and sweet Annie and rutabagas and radishes and random annuals to really fill in the herbaceous layer this spring. In other words, to really follow the rule of nature abhors a vacuum. Nature never allows you to just clear an area and then say, oh, I'll come back to it later. So in this area, a couple of trees are down, and now an equal number of trees have been planted to replace that canopy in the long run, with an eye towards making sure we facilitate more complexity in this area come spring. Now there's even more layers to it which I'd like to share, so let me go to a new spot and talk about that. So now I'm standing a little bit more to the north end of all of this. I was just walking northbound showing you these mulberries, and now I'm a little further up, and now I'm looking at, well, let me start where the beginning is. There's more or less due east, and so there's the spring sun arcing through a stand of larch, so there'll be shade in the morning a little bit, and then lots and lots of crazy amounts of sun that'll be coming through here. So this is really ready to be productive. And so now in this area where there weren't trees and roots, well, there was one, not black cherry, but it'll come back to me. I'm a little cold here. But anyway, I went through and used a broad fork and opened up the soil in this area and planted out 150 cloves of elephant garlic, and then used a broad fork in here, and when we had a little break and the soil was thawed out, put in about 200 cuttings of a mix of elderberry, yastaberry, pink currants, black currants, red currants. So this is becoming a nursery space in the middle of the woods here too. So again, that same theme of, if I'm going to take the time in the winter to fell all these trees and chop them all up, I really need to be thinking through how to fill that space ASAP. And coming full circle again to this Hugelmound idea, these beds are great as they are. They can break down as they go. And in fact, when I was broad forking this bed to put in the cloves of garlic, anytime I found tufts of weeds, I threw them on top of the Hugelmound with the idea that they won't thrive on top of this, but as they break down and decompose, they'll add organic matter that'll wash through. And if time allows, we'll dump some compost on the top of this with the same idea of spiking it with nutrient, adding more weight and nutrient to work its way down through with the spring rains, and it'll be growable soon enough. One thing to consider is, here's this future garden bed with all this excess nutrient coming out through it. Next to the bed, we have an opportunity to plant, for example, I could broad fork right around the edge of this and plant winter squash or some sort of climbing vining crop that can work its way over, use this as a low lumpy trellis, maybe watermelons, that kind of thing, where their roots are down in the soil next to it, but they can use this as a space to grow and help add some weight to help break it down. But again, I'm not in a rush to plant these out. I've planted everywhere around it. You can see in the future we'll have a ridiculous amount of amazing beds. All of these will be planted to shrubs and trees in 2020, in 2022, whenever, not a rush. But it's a way to really fold these trees into the landscape. I put 12 Scots pine into these piles over the last few months. And so now there's just huge amounts of light to work with. I'm realizing this video is running a little long, so hopefully this is compelling to a few of you. I'm sure I've lost most of you by now, but that's okay. I hope you're enjoying your next videos. But I was going to take a little moment and walk to the northern end of the property and look at some of this same pattern being played out. So this is a very similar pattern played out actually at a larger scale. All of the darker material, the lumps, they are, again, future Hugelmounds. They are a mix of white ash tops and Scots pine folded into each other to be future garden beds. And in here, that same break when we had a little thaw, I went in, and these are all grafted standard apples planted with rings around them. They have companionship of walking onion, thyme, and oregano to help defend them for now. And you can see there's so much deer traffic through here that if we didn't have the cages, they'd already be chewed apart. So it's a little bit more straightforward planting, right in the center. one tree. In the spring, I might add gumi or autumn olive to support these. To the south, maybe sea buckthorn or sea berry. And all the areas in between them will have shrub layers like currants, yasta berries, raspberries to fill out. And again, 2 to 5 years from now, all of these beds will be filled with more trees and shrubs, quite likely from cuttings and divisions from these plants that will be very established by then. All the ash that were cut, any sections that had really nice clean lengths to them were set aside off the ground, and these will be parts of permanent, very strong wooden trellises throughout the woods. We're going to set locust posts and run ash along the top to make trellises for vining crops like schisandra and hardy kiwi and grapes and all those sorts of beings, as trellises that go over permanent walkways into these glades. That's for another video. That's going to be a lot of fun to share, but that's a way to take the ash, which is much higher value as strong, beautiful structural wood than it is as decomposing material in a hugelmound. You can see in that grandma white pine there's a bunch of ash that will be turned into top rails for these beautiful trellises. Long enough video, so much to talk about, but I'm just going to pause here. But again, this is just one way of looking at the concept of the hugelmound in a long-term, long time scale. And I'm not prescribing this as the best way in any way. It's just another way, and should be in part of your toolkit as an option that you can lean into if you've got tremendous amounts of biomass, not a tremendous amount of time, and not pressure to have to plant into them ASAP. So there's another new orchard. Maybe 100 trees will have been cut down when this is all said and done. About 300 trees and shrubs of at least 50 different species and varieties will be replaced into this context, hopefully for the good for all. Thanks for watching.